The church was quiet except for the occasional murmur of guests and the sniffles of those seated in the front pews. I stood near the back, detached from the sea of black-clad mourners, unsure why I'd even come. Jason, my wife Lauren's co-worker, was dead. A freak car accident, they said. The whole office had been shaken, Lauren especially. She'd insisted we attend the funeral together, saying it was the least we could do to honor him. I'd never met Jason before, but Lauren spoke of him often. She'd been mentoring him, guiding him through the early stages of his career. She called him a bright light in their often dull corporate world. Now, watching her from a distance as she wiped away a tear, I couldn't help but feel off. The ceremony was beautiful, if not a little generic. The eulogies painted Jason as kind, ambitious, and a little too trusting for his own good. Lauren sat beside me, her hands trembling slightly. I reached for her, but she pulled away, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. As the service ended, we moved to the reception hall for the wake. I tried to stay close to Lauren, but she drifted between groups of Jason's family and co-workers like she belonged there more than I did. It wasn't until I grabbed a drink and overheard a conversation near the buffet table that my world began to tilt. Two women were whispering, their voices low but urgent. "He loved her, you know," one said, her tone filled with admiration. "I know," the other replied. "They were always so close. I can't imagine what she's going through." I stiffened, my ears straining to hear. "It's tragic," the first woman continued. "He was practically her other half." My stomach churned. They couldn't be talking about Lauren, could they? I turned to face them, trying to act casual. "Sorry, I couldn't help but overhear." "Who are you talking about?" They exchanged a quick glance. Then one of them smiled awkwardly. "Oh, just Jason and, a close friend. You know, office stuff?" I nodded, pretending to accept the answer, but the knot in my chest tightened. Later that night, as we drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about those words. He loved her. Lauren stared out the window, silent and distant. "You okay?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She nodded without looking at me. "Yeah, it's just hard to believe he's gone." Her voice cracked slightly, and I felt a pang of guilt. Maybe I was reading too much into it. Maybe she was just grieving. But a small, nagging voice in the back of my mind whispered something darker. The car ride home was suffocatingly quiet. Lauren had barely said a word since leaving the wake. Her eyes were red, her cheeks streaked with tear tracks, and she gripped her purse like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. I glanced at her, the conversation I'd overheard replaying in my mind. He loved her. The words clung to me like smoke. "You were really close with Jason, huh?" I asked cautiously. Lauren tensed, but didn't turn to look at me. "Yeah, he was a good person. I just feel so bad for his family." Her voice wavered slightly, and for a moment, I considered letting it go. But I couldn't. "You've mentioned mentoring him before," I said. "What was he like?" She finally turned to me, her eyes glassy. "Ambitious. Kind. He always wanted to learn more, do better. He had so much potential." Her voice cracked, and she trailed off, turning back to the window. When we got home, Lauren excused herself to take a shower. I sat in the living room, staring at nothing in particular as the unease settled deeper into my chest. Her reaction wasn't unusual. Jason was young, his death sudden. Anyone would be shaken. But there was something about the way she spoke about him. Later that night, as we lay in bed, I tried again. "You didn't talk much on the way home," I said, keeping my tone gentle. Lauren shifted under the covers. "I'm just tired, okay? I get that. It's just you seemed really upset. More than anyone else, I mean." She sighed, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "What do you want me to say, Adam? He was my coworker. We worked together almost every day. Of course, I'm upset." Her tone was sharp, defensive, and it caught me off guard. "I'm not accusing you of anything," I said quickly. "I'm just worried about you." "Well, don't be," she snapped. "I just need some time." She rolled over, her back to me, leaving me staring at the ceiling. The next day, while Lauren was at work, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her reaction at the funeral, her defensiveness, it didn't add up. I grabbed my laptop and started searching for information about Jason. His obituary was easy enough to find, and it was full of glowing praise. A bright, dedicated young man taken too soon. But it was his social media that caught my attention. Jason's profiles were full of pictures, office gatherings, vacations, and casual snapshots with friends. But as I scrolled further, I noticed something odd. Lauren was in several of the photos. At first, it made sense, office parties, team outings, but the more I looked, the closer they seemed. One photo in particular made my stomach drop. It was a selfie Jason had taken at a cafe. Lauren sat across from him, smiling warmly at the camera, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The caption read, "Great company as always." I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. I couldn't remember the last time Lauren had looked at me that way. The seed of doubt had grown into something darker. I needed answers. The cafe photo haunted me. I stared at it for what felt like hours, dissecting every detail. The way Lauren leaned slightly toward Jason, the casual intimacy in her smile, and the way his caption made it sound like this wasn't their first meeting. Great company, as always. I tried to reason with myself. They worked together. It wasn't unusual for co-workers to grab coffee or hang out. But there was something about this that felt too familiar. I scrolled further through Jason's profile, looking for more clues. Another post stopped me cold. It was a picture of a book, one I recognized immediately because it had been sitting on our coffee table for months. Lauren had been obsessed with it, saying it was her favorite read of the year. Jason's caption read, "Finally took her recommendation." She was right. This one's a must-read. Her recommendation. My stomach churned. She hadn't mentioned suggesting books to Jason. I started noticing more connections. Jason's posts referenced inside jokes and shared experiences that didn't make sense unless they'd spent a lot of time together outside of work. That night, I couldn't bring myself to bring it up. Lauren came home late, saying she'd had to stay at the office to finish a project. She looked exhausted, her hair slightly messy, her eyes red. "You okay?" I asked, masking my growing suspicion. "Yeah," she said quickly. "Just a long day." I wanted to ask more, to push her for details, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I nodded and let her retreat to the bedroom. The next day, while she was at work, I decided to dig deeper. I logged into her email, something I'd never done before, but justified in my growing paranoia. At first, there was nothing unusual: work emails, spam, the usual clutter. But then I found it, a folder labeled personal. My heart raced as I clicked it open. Inside were a handful of emails between Lauren and Jason. Most of the messages were casual, discussions about work, upcoming projects, but one thread caught my attention. The subject line read, "Can't stop thinking about last night." I clicked it, my breath catching as I read Jason's words. "Lauren, I know we said we'd keep things professional, but I can't stop thinking about you. Last night was incredible. I don't know where this is going, but I don't want it to end." Her reply was shorter, but just as damning. "I feel the same way. Let's be careful. Adam can't know." I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. This wasn't just a casual fling. This was emotional, personal, something they'd both fought to keep hidden. I closed the laptop, my hands trembling. The doubts that had been swirling in my mind were no longer doubts. They were facts. Lauren had been lying to me. Jason wasn't just a co-worker or a mentee. He'd been her lover. I closed the laptop, but the words lingered in my mind. "Let's be careful. Adam can't know." They'd hidden this from me for who knows how long. All the moments I dismissed as paranoia, all the late nights and distant conversations, it had all been real. I paced the living room, trying to control the storm of emotions swirling in my chest. Anger, humiliation, sadness, they all fought for dominance. Lauren came home an hour later, her keys jingling as she stepped through the door. "Hey," she said, setting her bag down. "What's for dinner?" The casual tone grated on me, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Whatever you want," I replied evenly. She glanced at me, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. "You okay? You seem off." I almost laughed at the irony. "Long day," I said, mirroring her usual excuse. The tension between us was unbearable that evening. Every word, every glance felt heavy with the weight of what I now knew. As Lauren disappeared into the bedroom to change, I debated my next move. I couldn't confront her. Not yet. I needed more. The next morning, I told Lauren I had a meeting across town. She barely acknowledged me, too busy scrolling through her phone. Instead of going to work, I drove to Jason's neighborhood. I didn't know what I was looking for, answers, closure, maybe just a sign that I wasn't crazy. When I arrived, I parked down the street and walked to his house. It was a modest home with a well-kept lawn, but it felt like stepping into enemy territory. A woman opened the door, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a sad smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. A coworker of Jason's," I lied. "I just wanted to pay my respects." Her expression softened, and she nodded. "Of course. I'm his mother, Carol. Please come in." The house was quiet, filled with the faint smell of flowers from the dozens of arrangements left after the funeral. Pictures of Jason lined the walls, most of them showing him smiling, full of life. I spotted one on a nearby table that made my stomach twist. It was Jason and Lauren, arm in arm, both beaming at the camera. Carol noticed me staring. "That was taken at the office holiday party last year," she said, her voice tinged with pride. "Lauren was such a good friend to him, always looking out for him." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. "He really admired her," Carol continued, her smile faltering slightly. "Talk about her all the time. I think she gave him hope, you know." I swallowed hard, the words hitting like a punch to the gut. As I left Jason's house, the weight of it all pressed down on me. Lauren wasn't just having an affair. She meant something to him. And by the looks of it, he meant something to her too. That evening, as Lauren sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "I stopped by Jason's house today," I said casually, watching her reaction. She froze, her fingers hovering over the screen. "Why would you do that?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Just wanted to pay my respects," I said, leaning back in my chair. "His mom said you two were close." Her eyes flicked to me, guarded. "We worked together every day. Of course we were close." I nodded, letting the silence stretch between us. "Did he ever mean more than that?" I asked, my voice calm but firm. Lauren's face hardened. "What are you implying?" "Nothing," I said, standing up. "Just something to think about." I walked out of the room, leaving her to stew. The cracks in her facade were starting to show. Lauren avoided me the rest of the evening. I could feel her tension radiating from across the room, her movements sharp and deliberate as she busied herself with chores she didn't normally care about. When she finally went to bed, I stayed in the living room, staring blankly at the muted TV. The weight of her lies pressed down on me like a physical force. She wasn't just hiding something. She was actively trying to keep me from seeing the truth. The next morning, as she got ready for work, I decided I couldn't keep the charade going. I needed answers, and I needed them now. "Lauren," I said as she tied her hair back in the hallway mirror. She didn't turn around. "Yeah." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer." That made her pause. She met my eyes in the mirror, her expression carefully neutral. "What is it?" I held up my phone, showing her the cafe photo from Jason's profile. "What's this?" I asked, my voice calm but firm. Her eyes widened briefly before she composed herself. "It's a photo. From work." "Why?" "It doesn't look like just work," I said, stepping closer. "You look pretty cozy." She turned to face me, crossing her arms defensively. "What are you trying to say, Adam? That I can't be friendly with my coworkers?" I didn't take the bait. "I'm saying it looks like more than friendly. And the way you've been acting lately, distant, secretive, it doesn't add up." Lauren's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing. "You're being ridiculous. Jason was my friend. That's all. Then why didn't you tell me about this?" I pressed. "Why did I have to find out from his mom that you were basically inseparable?" Her face reddened. "You're blowing this out of proportion. I don't have to tell you every little thing about my life, Adam." I nodded slowly, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "You're right. You don't. But when I see emails like this," I held up my phone again, this time with the incriminating email thread. "I think I deserve some answers." Her face drained of color as she stared at the screen. For a moment, she was speechless. "Where did you get that?" she finally whispered. "Does it matter?" I shot back. "Just tell me the truth, Lauren. How long were you and Jason involved?" Her hands trembled as she reached for the phone, but I pulled it back. "Answer me," I demanded, my voice rising. She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "Adam, it wasn't like that. You don't understand." "Then make me understand," I shouted. "Because right now, all I see is a liar who's been cheating on me." Lauren broke down, sinking onto the couch as the tears started to fall. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We got close, too close. But I ended it months ago. I swear. Her words hit like a sledgehammer. I wanted to believe her, but the betrayal was too raw. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice cracking. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. Because I didn't want to lose you. I stared at her, the anger warring with the sadness in my chest. I don't even know who you are anymore, I said, my voice low. She sobbed harder, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. Not now. The first crack in her lies had appeared, but I knew there was more. Lauren didn't come to bed that night. I could hear her sobbing quietly in the living room, the sound both infuriating and heartbreaking. I wanted to feel sympathy, to believe that her tears were genuine, but the image of that email and her defensive lies were burned into my mind. I stared at the ceiling, replaying her words over and over. I ended it months ago. If that was true, why had she been acting so distraught at Jason's funeral? Why had she been so secretive in the months leading up to his death? None of it made sense. The next morning, Lauren tried to act like nothing had happened. She moved around the kitchen making coffee, her movements robotic, her eyes avoiding mine. We need to talk, I said, my voice breaking the uncomfortable silence. She froze for a moment before turning to face me. I don't know what else you want me to say, Adam, she said quietly. The truth, I replied firmly. All of it. She sat down at the table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. What do you want to know? I leaned forward, meeting her gaze. How long were you seeing him? Lauren hesitated, biting her lip. About 6 months, she admitted, her voice barely audible. I clenched my fists under the table, the confirmation like a punch to the gut. And you ended it? When? 3 months ago, she said, her eyes welling with tears. It wasn't right. I knew that. I told him we couldn't keep doing it. I wanted to believe her, but something still didn't sit right. If you ended it, why were you so broken up at the funeral? Her face crumpled, and she buried her face in her hands. Because I still cared about him, Adam, she sobbed. I didn't want him to die. I didn't want it to end like that. Her words stung, but they didn't explain everything. And the emails? I pressed. The ones about last night being incredible? That doesn't sound like someone who ended things months ago. Lauren looked up at me, panic flashing in her eyes. Those were old. I forgot to delete them. I didn't want you to see them, because I knew you'd think the worst. My chest tightened as I stared at her, searching for any sign of honesty. Her tears looked real, her voice trembled with emotion. But was it guilt, or just regret that she'd been caught? I don't know if I can believe you, I said finally, my voice breaking. She reached across the table, grabbing my hand. Adam, please. I made a mistake, but I love you. I want to fix this. Please let me fix this. I pulled my hand away, standing abruptly. I need some time to think, I said, walking out the door before she could respond. I drove aimlessly for hours, the weight of her confession pressing down on me. Her words swirled in my mind, mingling with the memories of the funeral, Jason's photos, and those damning emails. She'd admitted to the affair, but something still didn't add up. Her reaction at the funeral, the whispers I'd overheard. There was more to this than she was letting on. That night, I decided to dig deeper. If Lauren wouldn't give me the full truth, I'd find it myself. I grabbed her phone from the kitchen counter while she was in the shower, unlocking it with the passcode I'd seen her use 100 times. Her messages were mostly mundane, chats with coworkers, group texts with friends. But when I searched for Jason's name, a thread popped up that made my heart stop. The last message from Jason was dated the night before he died. I need to see you. This isn't over. Lauren's response was even worse. Not tonight. Adam's home. I stared at the screen, my blood boiling. She'd lied about ending the affair months ago. Jason had been trying to see her the night he died. The truth wasn't just about an affair. It was about a betrayal she'd been actively covering up. And now, I was determined to uncover everything. I couldn't sleep that night. Jason's last text to Lauren echoed in my head. I need to see you. This isn't over. She hadn't just been lying to me. She'd been lying to herself, pretending the affair was over when it clearly wasn't. The next morning, Lauren acted as if nothing had happened. She made coffee, hummed to herself, and tried to pull me into a casual conversation about weekend plans. I couldn't take it anymore. When were you going to tell me about Jason's message? I asked abruptly. Her cheerful facade crumbled in an instant. What? I held up her phone, the damning text thread open on the screen. This, I said, my voice cold. He texted you the night before he died. What wasn't over, Lauren? What were you still doing with him? She stared at the screen, her face pale. Adam, I can explain. Then explain. I snapped, slamming the phone onto the table. Because right now, it looks like you were still seeing him behind my back. Lauren sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. I wasn't, she whispered. I swear I wasn't. He didn't want to let go. I folded my arms, narrowing my eyes. And you didn't think to tell me? You didn't think I deserved to know he was still trying to see you? Her voice cracked as she spoke. I didn't want to hurt you, Adam. I thought if I ignored him, he'd stop. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that Jason was the one clinging to something that was already over. But then I remembered her reaction at the funeral. The whispered conversations I'd overheard. The way she grieved as though she'd lost more than just a co-worker. I don't believe you, I said finally. Her head snapped up, tears streaming down her face. Adam, please. Save it. I interrupted. You've been lying to me for months. Why should I believe anything you say now? I stormed out of the house, needing space to think. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but they painted a picture I didn't want to see. That afternoon, I drove back to Jason's house. His mother, Carol, greeted me warmly, clearly not suspecting the storm brewing beneath my surface. Is everything okay? She asked as she led me into the living room. I hesitated before speaking. Carol, I need to ask you something personal. She nodded, her expression concerned. Did Jason ever talk about Lauren? I mean, outside of work? Her face softened, and she smiled faintly. Oh, he adored her. He said she was the only person who truly understood him. My chest tightened. Did he ever mention feelings for her? Carol's smile faded, and she looked away. He did, she admitted softly. He said he loved her, but he also said it was complicated, that she wasn't free to love him back. I left Jason's house in a daze. Lauren had been more than just his lover. She'd been his obsession, his reason for hope, and ultimately his heartbreak. And now, I was beginning to wonder if his death really had been an accident. The drive back from Jason's house was a blur. His mother's words stuck with me. He loved her. But it was complicated. I tried to push the thought aside, but a darker question crept in. Jason's death. Had it truly been an accident? Or had something else happened that night? When I got home, Lauren was sitting on the couch, staring at her phone. She looked up as I walked in, her face a mix of guilt and anxiety. Where were you? She asked, her voice cautious. Talking to Jason's mother, I said flatly. Her eyes widened, panic flickering across her face. Why would you do that? I wanted answers, I replied, dropping my keys on the table. And I got them. Lauren stood, wringing her hands. Adam, whatever she said, it's not what you think. She said Jason loved you. I interrupted. That you were the only person who understood him. Does that sound like a simple work relationship to you? Her face crumpled, and she sank back onto the couch. I told you, she whispered. It wasn't supposed to happen. I ended it. But Jason, he didn't want to let go. I clenched my fists, the anger bubbling up again. And the night he died? Did you see him? Did you meet him after he sent that text? Lauren's head shot up, her eyes wide. No, of course not. But there was something in her voice, a tremor, a hesitation, that made me pause. I walked closer, leaning down to meet her gaze. You swear to me, Lauren? You swear you weren't with him that night? Tears streamed down her face as she whispered. I wasn't. I stayed home. Où suis-je, Adam? I stared at her, searching for any sign of deception. If she was lying, she was good at it. Fine, I said, stepping back. But if I find out you're hiding anything else, we're done. Do you understand me? She nodded silently, her shoulders shaking with sobs. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Lauren's denial replayed in my mind, but so did her defensiveness, her panic. If she wasn't with Jason that night, then who was? The next day, I decided to revisit the accident itself. The news articles I'd read when it happened had been brief, focusing more on Jason's promising future than the details of his death. But now I needed specifics. Jason's car had veered off a sharp curve late at night, crashing into a tree. The reports called it a freak accident, wet roads, low visibility. But something about it felt too convenient. I found a police report buried online, and one line stood out. No signs of braking before impact. No braking. Jason had been driving fast enough to crash, but he hadn't even tried to stop. I sat back in my chair, my pulse quickening. Was it possible Jason's death hadn't been an accident? Could someone have been in the car with him? That evening, I confronted Lauren again. What do you know about Jason's accident? I asked, my voice steady. She looked up from her dinner, startled. What do you mean? Why was he out so late? Why was he driving so fast? Lauren paled, setting down her fork. I don't know. I didn't talk to him that night. Then, why does it feel like you're hiding something? I pressed. Why can't you just be honest with me? Her eyes filled with tears again. Because you don't believe me no matter what I say, she cried. I wasn't with him, Adam. I didn't even know he was out that night. Her outburst caught me off guard, but it didn't ease the knot in my stomach. There were still too many unanswered questions, too many gaps in her story. And the more I dug, the more I felt like I was standing on the edge of something far darker than just an affair. Lauren's outburst didn't sit right with me. Her tears and shaky voice seemed genuine, but there was something about the way she deflected, always turning the questions back on me, that felt like a calculated move. I left the house that night, needing air and space to think. The more I unraveled Jason's life and death, the more it felt like Lauren's role was far more significant than she admitted. But if she wasn't with him the night he died, why did I feel like she still carried the weight of it? I drove aimlessly for hours before pulling into a parking lot near Jason's office building. It was late, the building dark and empty, but something about being there grounded me. Jason's life had been centered here. His career, his relationships. This was where Lauren had met him, where their affair had begun. And maybe, just maybe, where I could find more answers. The security guard was half asleep when I walked in. I lied, telling him I was there to pick up something Lauren had left behind, and he waved me through without a second glance. Jason's desk was easy to find, a small plaque with his name marking his space. It was eerily tidy, as if someone had already cleared it out. I rummaged through the few remaining items, pens, a notebook, some office supplies, until I found a drawer that was locked. A quick search revealed a key taped under his desk. I unlocked the drawer, my pulse quickening as I pulled it open. Inside was a small notebook, its cover worn and edges frayed. Flipping through the pages, I realized it was a personal journal. The entries were brief but revealing, written in Jason's neat handwriting. He'd chronicled his work struggles, personal goals, and, most damningly, his relationship with Lauren. Saw her today. She looked so beautiful. I wish I didn't feel this way, but I can't stop. She says we need to end things, but I can't. I love her too much. She promised she'd talk to him tonight. Maybe this is the start of something real for us. The date on the final entry stopped me cold. It was the night Jason died. I closed the notebook, my hands trembling. Lauren had lied again. She claimed she wasn't in contact with Jason that night, but his words painted a different picture. She'd promised to talk to him. Was Jason referring to me? Had Lauren been planning to leave me for him? And if that was the case, what had happened after the conversation? When I got home, Lauren was asleep on the couch, her face pale and drawn. For a moment, I hesitated, wondering if I should confront her with what I'd found. Instead, I slipped into the bedroom and locked the journal in my desk. Lauren wasn't ready to tell the truth, but I was getting closer to finding it myself. The next morning, I called Jason's mother. Carol, I began cautiously. Did Jason mention anything about Lauren the night before he... She was quiet for a moment. He called me, she said finally, her voice soft. He said he was meeting someone important, someone who could change everything. My stomach sank. Did he say who? No, Carol Blade. But he sounded hopeful, like he thought this was his chance to finally be happy. I thanked her and hung up, the weight of her words sinking in. Jason had thought Lauren was going to leave me for him, but something had gone wrong. That evening, I waited for Lauren to come home. When she walked through the door, I didn't waste any time. We need to talk, I said, my tone firm. She froze, her expression guarded. About what? I held up Jason's journal. Her face went white. Where did you get that? She demanded, her voice rising. It doesn't matter, I replied. What matters is what's in here. You promised him something that night, Lauren. What was it? She took a step back, her eyes darting toward the door. Adam, you're digging into things you don't understand. Then help me understand. I shouted. What did you promise him? Were you planning to leave me for him? Tears welled in her eyes, but this time, they didn't move me. I don't know, she cried. I didn't know what I wanted. Her confession felt like a slap. All the lies, the secrecy. It had all been to protect herself, not me. But as I stared at her, another question burned in my mind. If you weren't with him that night, I said slowly, then why did he die thinking you would be? Lauren's tears fell silently, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the couch. My question hung in the air. If you weren't with him that night, then why did he die thinking you would be? She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. You owe me the truth, I said, my voice low but firm. No more lies, Lauren. No more half-answers. She nodded, wiping her face with the back of her hand. I told him I'd meet him, she whispered finally. But I didn't mean it. I didn't know how else to make him stop. Stop what? I pressed. Pressuring me, she said, her voice cracking. He kept asking me to leave you. You wouldn't let it go, Adam. I thought if I told him what he wanted to hear, he'd back off. I stared at her, my chest tight with a mix of anger and disbelief. So you lied to him? You let him think there was a chance? I didn't know what else to do, she cried. I was scared. He was obsessed, Adam. He wouldn't take no for an answer. Her words twisted in my mind, a new layer of doubt settling over everything. If Jason had been obsessed with Lauren, had his death been more than an accident? What happened after you told him you'd meet him? I asked. She shook her head. Nothing. I stayed home. I didn't answer his calls. I thought he'd just move on. Her voice cracked on the last words, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. I took a step back, letting her confession sink in. Jason's journal, his final messages, her promises, they all pointed to a man who believed he'd finally get the life he wanted. But instead, he died alone on a dark road. Did he ever threaten you? I asked, my voice cautious. Lauren hesitated, her eyes darting away. Lauren, I said firmly, did Jason ever threaten you? Yes, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But I didn't think he'd hurt me. He just said things, that if I didn't meet him, he'd make sure you found out about us. My blood ran cold. Jason hadn't just been obsessed. He'd been desperate, willing to do whatever it took to force her hand. And now, I couldn't shake the feeling that his death wasn't as random as it seemed. The next day, I called Detective Simmons, the officer who'd handled Jason's accident. I explained my concerns, carefully leaving out Lauren's involvement. It's probably nothing, I said, but I noticed the report mentioned no signs of breaking. Do you think it's worth looking into again? Simmons sighed. We investigated thoroughly at the time. No foul play, no evidence of another vehicle. Just a tragic accident. But what about his state of mind? I pressed. Did anyone check if he was under stress? Or if there were signs he might have done it on purpose? There was a long pause. There were no indicators of that, Simmons said carefully. But if you have reason to believe otherwise, you're welcome to provide additional information. I hung up, the weight of his words pressing down on me. Jason's death might not have been foul play, but it didn't feel like an accident either. When I got home, Lauren was sitting on the couch, her knees drawn to her chest. She looked up at me, her eyes hollow. Are you going to leave me? She asked quietly. Her question caught me off guard. I don't know, I admitted. Right now, I'm just trying to figure out how we got here. Her lip trembled, but she didn't say anything else. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Jason. His desperation, his threats, his final night, it all pointed to a man who felt like he'd lost everything. And now, I was beginning to wonder if he'd taken his life to punish Lauren. Lauren barely spoke the next morning. She lingered in the kitchen, absently stirring her coffee, as if it were the only thing tethering her to the present. I watched her from across the room, unsure of what to say. Her confession from the night before had cracked something open, but it wasn't just my anger anymore. It was pity. Jason's obsession, her lies, and his death had created a storm neither of us could escape. But there were still too many unanswered questions. I broke the silence. Did Jason ever say anything that made you think he'd hurt himself? Lauren's hand froze mid-stir, and she stared into the cup as though it held the answer. I don't know, she whispered. He talked about being lost, about how hard it was to see me every day and not have more. But I never thought he'd do something like that. I leaned forward. He said he'd make sure I found out. Do you think? She looked up, her eyes wide with panic. You think he did it on purpose? To punish me? The thought had been circling my mind since I'd found his journal, but saying it aloud felt heavier than I expected. I don't know, I said, but everything points to someone who felt like he had nothing left to lose. The idea left both of us shaken. Lauren disappeared into the bedroom, and I sat on the couch, replaying Jason's last moments in my head. If Jason had taken his own life, then Lauren's role in his death was even more complicated. But another part of me wondered if it was truly that simple. His death still felt wrong. That evening, I received an email from Carol, Jason's mother. Adam, I found something I think you should see. It was in Jason's things, and I thought of you when I read it. Let me know if you want to meet. My heart raced as I replied, arranging to visit her the next day. The following morning, Carol greeted me at the door with a strained smile. She led me to the living room, where she handed me an envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. I unfolded it carefully, Jason's neat handwriting staring back at me. Lauren, I'll try to be patient, but I can't wait anymore. You said you'd meet me, and I'm holding you to that. If you don't show up tonight, I'll make sure Adam knows everything. You don't get to walk away from this without consequences. My stomach churned as I finished reading. Where did you find this? I asked Carol, my voice shaking. In his car, she said softly. The police gave it back to us after the investigation. I didn't know what it meant until now. I nodded numbly, my mind spinning. Jason had left this letter in his car, a final ultimatum to Lauren. If she didn't meet him that night, he planned to expose her. But instead of her showing up, he died alone on a dark road. When I got home, Lauren was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. She looked up as I walked in, her face pale. What did Carol want? She asked cautiously. I handed her the letter without a word. Her eyes scanned the page, and her hands trembled as she read. When she finished, she looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. I didn't know, she whispered. I didn't know he felt this way. Did you? I asked, my voice cold. Did you even care? She sobbed, burying her face in her hands. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, Adam. I just wanted it to stop. I didn't want anyone to get hurt. Her guilt was palpable, but it didn't erase the damage she'd done. Jason's death might not have been her fault directly, but her lies and manipulation had driven him to the edge. And now, I was left to decide whether I could forgive her, or if this was the final straw. Lauren sat on the couch, clutching the letter like it was a lifeline, her sobs shaking her entire body. I stood a few feet away, torn between anger and an almost unbearable sense of pity. Adam, she choked out between tears, you have to believe me. I never thought it would come to this. You told him you'd meet him, I said, my voice cold and measured. You gave him hope when you knew there was none. She looked up at me, her face a mixture of guilt and desperation. I was scared. He said he'd ruin everything if I didn't give him what he wanted. I didn't know what else to do. I ran a hand through my hair, pacing the room. And when you didn't show up, he died. Don't you get that, Lauren? You didn't just lie to me, you played with his life. She broke down completely, covering her face with her hands. I know, she whispered. I know I screwed up, but I didn't want anyone to get hurt. I just wanted to fix things, to make it all go away. Her words struck a nerve. I felt the weight of everything crashing down. The lies, the betrayal, the tangled mess of emotions that had consumed all three of us. Did you love him? I asked abruptly. Lauren's head snapped up, her tear-streaked face pale. What? She stammered. Did you love him? I repeated, my voice sharp. She hesitated, her silence stretching into an eternity. Finally, she whispered, I don't know. Her answer was like a slap. Not a denial, not a definitive yes, but an admission that there was something there, something she couldn't ignore or fully admit. That's not good enough, I said, my voice breaking. After everything you've put me through, that's not good enough, Lauren. She stood, reaching for me, but I stepped back. Adam, please, she begged. I chose you. I stayed. Doesn't that mean anything? I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. You didn't choose me. You chose to lie to both of us until it all fell apart. And now Jason's dead, and I don't even know who I'm married to anymore. I left the house without another word, slamming the door behind me. The air outside was cold, biting at my skin as I walked aimlessly through the neighborhood. My mind raced with everything I'd learned, every confession Lauren had made. Her lies had destroyed more than just our marriage. They destroyed a man who thought he'd finally found something real. And now, I wasn't sure if there was anything left to salvage. Later that night, I sat in my car parked a few blocks away from the house. The street was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the engine. I pulled out my phone and opened the last recording I had of Jason's voice. The voicemail he'd left Lauren the day before he died. "Lauren, I don't know what you're so afraid of. Just meet me tonight. We can figure this out together. I can't keep doing this alone." His voice was calm, almost hopeful, but there was an undercurrent of desperation that sent chills down my spine. I leaned back in my seat, closing my eyes. The weight of everything felt unbearable. Jason's death wasn't my fault. It wasn't even Lauren's fault, not entirely. But her lies, her manipulation, they'd set this tragedy in motion, and I couldn't ignore that. For the first time, I realized I wasn't just grieving Jason. I was grieving the marriage I thought I had, the woman I thought I knew. When I finally returned home, Lauren was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the wall. She looked up as I entered, her eyes hollow. "Are you leaving me?" she asked quietly. I didn't answer right away. "I don't know," I said finally. "But I can't stay here tonight." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I turned and walked out the door, unsure if I'd ever come back. The motel room was small and sterile, its beige walls and thin curtains doing little to block out the faint glow of the streetlights outside. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the single suitcase I'd hastily packed. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from Lauren. "Lauren, please come home. We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes." I stared at the message, my emotions swinging wildly between anger and sorrow. Part of me wanted to go back, to pretend we could pick up the pieces. But the other part knew it wasn't that simple. The next day, I met Mark, my oldest friend, at a diner on the edge of town. He listened quietly as I recounted everything. The affair, the lies, the letter, Jason's obsession. "That's heavy, man," he said finally, shaking his head. "I don't even know what to say. I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice hollow. "She's begging me to come back, but every time I look at her, all I see is him." Mark leaned back in the booth, folding his arms. "You've been through hell, Adam. No one would blame you if you walked away. But if you think there's still something worth saving, you've got to figure that out for yourself." I spent the rest of the day driving aimlessly, my mind replaying every moment of the past week. Lauren's tears, Jason's desperation, the suffocating weight of betrayal. It all felt like a storm I couldn't outrun. By the time I pulled back into the motel parking lot, I'd made a decision. I needed answers. Real ones, not half-truths or evasions. And Lauren was the only person who could give them to me. When I walked through the front door, she was sitting on the couch, her face pale and drawn. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with hope and fear. "You came back," she whispered. "Don't read into it," I said, my voice firm. "I'm not here to forgive you. I'm here for the truth." Lauren swallowed hard, nodding. "Okay, ask me anything." I sat across from her, keeping my distance. "The night Jason died, did you really stay home?" "Yes," she said immediately. I studied her face, searching for any sign of hesitation. "Then why didn't you answer his calls? Why didn't you tell me what was going on?" Her hands twisted nervously in her lap. "I thought if I ignored him, he'd leave me alone. I didn't think it would end like this." I leaned forward, my voice low. "Did you know he was planning to blackmail you?" Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. "What?" "The letter," I said, pulling it from my jacket pocket and holding it up. "He said if you didn't meet him, he'd make sure I found out about everything." Lauren's face crumpled, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I swear, Adam, I didn't know. He never told me that." Her sobs filled the room, but I stayed where I was, unmoved. "Whether you knew or not doesn't change what happened. Your lies put this in motion, Lauren, and now Jason's dead, and our marriage is hanging by a thread." She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. "I'll do anything to fix this," she said. "Anything. Just tell me what to do." I stood, pacing the room. "You can start by telling me why," I said, my voice breaking. "Why him? Why throw everything away for someone like Jason?" Lauren's sobs quieted as she struggled to find the words. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "It wasn't about him, Adam. It was about me. I felt lost, invisible, and he made me feel seen. Her words hit like a punch to the gut, but they were the first honest thing she'd said in weeks. For the first time, I saw the cracks in her, the insecurities and flaws she'd tried so hard to hide. But was that enough? Could I forgive her for everything she'd done? Not just to me, but to Jason? I didn't know the answer yet. The house was quiet, save for the faint sound of Lauren's muffled sobs. I stood by the window, staring out at the darkened street, the weight of her confession pressing down on me. I felt lost, invisible. Her words echoed in my mind, cutting deeper than any excuse or justification. She hadn't just betrayed me. She'd betrayed herself, seeking validation in a way that had shattered everything we'd built. I turned back to her, still sitting on the couch, her hands trembling as she clutched a tissue. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, breaking the silence. "Why didn't you come to me if you felt that way?" Lauren looked up at me, her eyes swollen and red. "Because I didn't know how," she whispered. "I thought if I told you, you'd think I was weak, that I wasn't good enough for you." I sat down across from her, keeping the distance between us. "You were good enough," I said, my voice trembling. "You were always good enough. But instead of trusting me, you turned to him." She nodded, her tears spilling over. "I know, and I hate myself for it. I've ruined everything, Adam. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging you to give me a chance to make it right." I leaned back, running a hand over my face. How? How do you fix something like this?" Lauren hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. "I can go to counseling. We can go to counseling. I'll do whatever it takes, Adam. Please, just don't leave me." Her plea hung in the air, and for a moment, I felt the weight of my decision settle on my chest. Could I stay? Could I rebuild the trust she'd broken? Or would staying mean losing myself in the process? I stood, pacing the room as my thoughts raced. Every memory of our life together flashed through my mind. The laughter, the arguments, the quiet moments of comfort that now felt like a distant dream. Finally, I stopped, turning to face her. "I need time," I said. "I can't make this decision tonight." Lauren nodded, her face crumpling. "Take all the time you need," she whispered. "I'll wait. I'll wait as long as it takes." That night, I packed a bag and left the house, the door closing softly behind me. I didn't know where I was going or how long I'd be gone, but I knew I needed space. Space to think, space to feel, space to figure out if there was anything left worth saving. As I drove aimlessly through the quiet streets, I thought about Jason, his desperation, his longing, and the way his life had spiraled out of control. He'd been caught in the same storm that was now tearing through mine, and I couldn't help but feel a flicker of sympathy for him. He hadn't deserved to die, but neither did I deserve to live with the aftermath of his choices or Lauren's. I parked by a small park and sat in the car, staring out at the empty swings swaying gently in the wind. My mind felt like a tangled web of anger, sadness, and regret. Was it possible to forgive her? Was it even worth trying? By the time the sun rose, I still didn't have an answer. But I knew one thing for sure. Whatever decision I made, it had to be for me. Not for Lauren, not for the marriage, but for my own peace of mind. And that decision would come soon. A week had passed since I'd left the house. Each day felt like a lifetime, my thoughts circling endlessly as I tried to decide what my future would look like. Lauren had texted a few times, each message more subdued than the last. "Lauren, I'm giving you space, but I just want you to know I love you. Lauren, I'm so sorry for everything. Please don't give up on us." I read them all, but never replied. It wasn't out of spite. It was because I didn't know what to say. On the 8th day, I decided I couldn't avoid it any longer. If there was any chance of moving forward together or apart, I needed to face her. When I walked into the house, Lauren was sitting at the dining table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She looked up as the door clicked shut, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and fear. "You're here," she said softly, standing as if she wasn't sure what to do. "I'm here," I replied, setting my bag down by the door. We sat across from each other, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. "I've been thinking a lot," I began, my voice steady despite the storm in my chest. "About us. About everything that's happened." Lauren nodded, her hands gripping the edge of the table. And I've realized that some things can't be undone," I said. You lied to me, Lauren. You broke my trust. You made choices that hurt both of us. And Jason. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. I know, she whispered. I hate myself for it. I've been trying to figure out how to make it right. But I know I can't erase what I did. I leaned back, letting out a long breath. I loved you, Lauren. I still do in a way. But what we've been through, it's too much. I don't know if I can ever look at you and not see what you did. Her sobs broke the silence, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But I pushed it aside. This wasn't about hurting her. It was about finding a way forward for both of us. I think we need to let go, I said, my voice cracking. Not just for me, but for you too. We can't keep holding on to something that's broken. Lauren covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. I don't want to lose you, she cried. But I understand. I ruined us. I know I did. I stood, moving to the doorway. I'll always care about you, I said. But I need to move on. And so do you. She looked up at me, her tear-streaked face filled with anguish. Goodbye, Adam, she whispered. Goodbye, Lauren, I replied, my voice barely audible. As I walked out of the house for the last time, a strange sense of calm settled over me. The pain was still there, but so was a feeling of relief, like I'd finally let go of a weight I'd been carrying for too long. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine to navigate. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt free. What would you have done in my shoes? Could you forgive? Or is trust too fragile to repair? Share your thoughts in the comments.